Hello and welcome to this lesson entitled Borders and Brezhnev. Hopefully by the end of this PowerPoint, both of those will be familiar. Hopefully Borders already is, but Brezhnev will be a little bit more familiar by the end. But here we go. So as we move through, I want you guys to think, are walls an effective method of keeping people out or keeping people in? As we move through this lesson, I want you guys to think on that question because that's really what we're talking about today, is walls. So we have to start at the beginning. We already talked about how in 1945, following World War II, Germany was split basically into the West and the East. So you had the Soviets controlling the East, and you had the US, the French, and the British controlling the West, and eventually they just kind of merged all together. From 1952 to 1961, the Soviets made crossing into West Berlin more and more difficult as time passes. Originally, you had to have a passport, then it was, okay, well, you have to have a pass. Okay, well, why are you going? What's your business? How long are you going to be there? It became a very intensive process to just cross into West Berlin. In June of 1961, East Germans were regularly crossing into West Berlin in fear that the border would be closed. Over the last 9 years, things had been steadily getting more and more strict, and a lot of Berliners started fearing that eventually the border would just be closed, and sure enough, they were right. On August 13th, 1961, the Berlin border was closed, meaning that no one could go from West Berlin to East Berlin, no one could come from East Berlin to West Berlin. It was effectively shut down. On August 17th, 4 days later, the construction of the Berlin Wall begins. And we've already kind of talked about the Berlin Wall a little bit, but that's what this whole kind of PowerPoint is going to be about. So the Soviets were worried about what is called a brain drain. Basically, they were scared that all the scientists, all the doctors, all the smart people would leave East Berlin to get to West Berlin. And so to keep that from happening, they built a wall to keep people in. And what we'll see is that the Berlin Wall, even though it was meant to kind of keep people in, the Soviets used it saying, no, it's not a wall to keep you in. It's a wall to keep the capitalists out. They were basically saying that it was an anti-fascist bulwark, which that's just a really fancy way of saying basically it's just a defense against capitalists. But really, it was to keep people from defecting. And defecting is just a word that means leaving one country for another. So the wall was basically, originally, it was not what you see kind of in the background here. Originally, it was just cinder blocks, barbed wire strung around, sandbags, but eventually it became mostly constructed of concrete and barbed wire with what is called the death strip in between. And the death strip is called that because it had soft sand, which made it difficult to run through. Also, it left tracks, dogs, which were trained to attack, different traps, and soldiers that were just kind of spaced throughout. 171 people died in the death strip while this wall was kind of created. The wall was 96 miles long with an average height of about 12 feet, and there are 4 phases of construction, each more complex than the last. In 1963, President JFK visited the wall and gave a speech to West Berlin, basically saying that the US and the other democratic countries of the world understood Berlin's sacrifice and the sacrifice of the Berliners and sided with Berlin. In 1964, Martin Luther King visited the wall and gave a speech to East Berlin. Now, there is an optional video attached to this PowerPoint that has a little bit of his visit to the wall, but not his speech. But I highly encourage you all to look up that speech because it is a very good speech, and it is just really interesting to see him talking to the East Berliners. Then in 1987, President Reagan had his famous speech about the wall, in which he asked Mr. Gorbachev, the kind of leader of the Soviet Union at that point, to tear down the wall. Now, a couple things about the wall. So, you have the inside wall, low tension electric fence, so you had an electrified fence. You had dogs marching back and forth. You had the control tower with guards that would kind of spy and snipe people. You had an area where basically jeeps and other vehicles could go around, basically patrol it. You had street lights, you had more barbed wire, you have traps, you have car trench, so if cars were trying to get across the wall, they'd fall into a trench. You have anti-tank obstacles, just in case someone wanted to take a tank and break through the wall. And you have the actual wall itself. And as you can see, there's kind of a rounded bit to the wall, just because it makes it a little bit harder for people to climb over. This whole thing was meant to keep people in. This is MLK at the wall. You can see it's kind of looking at, and you can even see that he's not very pleased with it. It's not a picture of MLK at the wall, kind of in one of the overgrown areas of it. So, escapes over the years. People didn't just say, oh, well, there's a wall, they don't want us to go over, we're not going to go over. In fact, a lot of people went over. A lot of soldiers actually defected as soon as they knew the wall was going up, while the wall was still basically just barbed wire. You can see this soldier in particular jumping over, just leaving. But over the years, it became harder and harder to get across the wall, so people had to get more and more creative. So you have people literally stealing trains and stealing tanks to get from one side to the other. You have, in one case, you have a gentleman in East Berlin taking a hot air balloon, floating it all the way up, and then floating it across the wall down below. You have someone stringing a tightrope from a building in East Berlin to a building in West Berlin, trying to cross the tightrope. You have a series of underground tunnels and people crawling through sewers over time, trying to get across this wall. You have people hiding in people's trunks, hiding in people's cars, all sorts of crazy stuff going on while people were trying to get away from East Berlin. Now, people were escaping for a lot of reasons, but the majority of the reason was to get away from the communist control. And throughout the years, there were regular protests on both sides of the wall, because even though West Berlin was doing okay, people still had family in East Berlin that weren't doing well, and they were still Berliners. They were still Germans that are separated by this wall, and you wouldn't want to see your fellow countrymen divided or treated poorly by a different government. So you have families, friends divided. West and East Berlin were very different economically. The western capital side was booming. It was doing really well. And the eastern side was not doing very well at all. It'd basically be like if you were to look at America today with McDonald's everywhere and Starbucks, and to look at America in the early 1900s. There's a very different economic system going on. This is a little bit of the graffiti on the Berlin Wall. This was also very common. There's actually a lot of really nice art on the Berlin Wall. I encourage you guys to look up pictures of that. This is actually a picture of basically the Berlin Wall coming down. More graffiti. More graffiti. This guy's actually going to the bathroom on the wall, which, you know, guards probably weren't too fond of. Right. So, during the time of the wall, there are multiple leaders, and different leaders had different things going on. In 1963, both the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to a limited nuclear test ban treaty, which meant that you could not test nuclear weapons in space, in the water, or in the upper atmosphere. Because of the radioactive fallout, no one was really sure what would happen if you tested a nuclear weapon in space. Would the radiation cover the entire Earth? Would it fall to Earth if you tested it in the water? Would it radioactivate the water? Would it make the water irradiated? Who knew? So they did not want to do that. They wanted to limit radioactive contamination from nuclear tests. This begins the slow process of ending the nuclear arms race. And we didn't really talk about the nuclear arms race too much, but it's basically just this process of the United States has a couple nukes. The Soviet Union has a couple nukes. The US decides to build more nukes. The Soviet Union decides to build more nukes. The US decides to build more nukes. It's basically just this never-ending cycle of having more and more deadly nuclear weapons. On November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson becomes president. And he's going to be important because he's basically president throughout the Vietnam War, among a couple other things. 1964, Khrushchev steps down and Brezhnev takes his place. Brezhnev was all about verbal communication between the USSR and the US. He thought that the easiest way to keep things like the Cuban Missile Crisis from happening again was to communicate, was to talk. His idea was to taunt or conflict de-escalation as major goal. He did not want to see nuclear war. He wanted conflicts to be basically taken care of peacefully, without issue. Now, as we kind of end, I want to ask you guys, why do you think people so badly wanted to escape from East Berlin? Just think about that. Think about different walls that have been put up in history, what their purpose is, what the purpose might be of future walls that go up around the world. What is their purpose? Are they effective? What do they do? And that's really about it